12. All roads lead to Khanbalik. Karakoram, Khanbalik, Yansu, Sipangu. In the cool cloisters of St. Mary's Abbey in the English city of York, the monks edified themselves by reading about the world beyond their enclosure. The cloister is now a rain-soaked ruin, but in the 14th century, there were about 50 brothers living there, all following the Benedictine rule. Reading and writing were central to their lives, part of their labour for God. Studying their books filled almost every space between services in their great vaulted church. One of the prized volumes in their library was a new manuscript, The History of the Mongols, written on vellum in dense black letters with red and blue initials. The monks of York read about the Mongols with delight, wonder, and shock. It was said that each Tatar man could have as many wives as he wished, one 100, another 50, another 10. They learned that Tatar women had a round thing made of twigs or bark on their heads, which they wore always in the presence of men and to distinguish themselves from other women. It was written, too, that unmarried women and young girls in Tatari were almost indistinguishable from men, as they all dressed in an identical manner. The Mongol people lived, it was said, in felt tents built with sticks. They worshipped idols, to whom they offered the first milk of each cow and mare. Where the York monks found something particularly memorable or worthy of note, they marked a little cross or sometimes a pointing finger, a manicule, in the book's margin to remind them and future readers to pay special attention to information worth recording. The York monk's manuscript was new, but the text had originally been composed by Brother Giovanni of Plano Carpini, a venerable man who had himself about 100 years previously visited and met the leader of the Mongols, the great Khan himself, Guyuk, died 1248. Brother Giovanni had travelled all the way to the Mongol court at Karakoram, over 9,000 kilometres east of the Pope's palace in Rome. He was one of the first Westerners known to have reached the court, and wrote the history of the Mongols based on his experiences there. Brother Lourenço, a Portuguese friar, had set out on a similar mission slightly earlier, but his fate is unknown. His book brought back to the West a wealth of knowledge about the Mongols, the people who ruled the world east of Europe, from just beyond Kiev all the way to Beijing. Brother Giovanni travelled with two other Franciscan friars, Stepan of Bohemia and Benedict of Poland. In the year 1245, Giovanni and Stepan departed from Lyon in France and met up with Benedict of Wrocław in Poland. They then travelled east and, within days, had endured hunger, thirst, extremes of cold and heat, and various minor personal injuries. The friars had been bidden by Pope Innocent IV to examine everything and to look at everything carefully, bringing back a full report on the conditions of the Mongols. They carried a papal bull requesting the Emperor of the Tatars to desist entirely from assaults on Christian nations and to cease the persecution of Christians. Their mission was mandated in the aftermath of the Mongol invasions of Poland and Hungary, which had, in the early 1240s, reached as far west as Legnica in Silesia and Trogir on the Dalmatian coast. The friars thus travelled as ambassadors of Christendom, seeking to understand an enemy who, it was widely assumed, was planning a campaign to occupy all of Europe. Giovanni, Stepan and Benedict made it only as far as the little town of Kaniv on the river Dnieper, before Stepan fell ill and could not continue. For almost half a year, Giovanni and Benedict made their way across the Tatars' land. Giovanni summarized his desolate attitude at the beginning of his book. To conclude briefly about this country, it is large, but otherwise, as we saw with our own eyes, for during 5.5 months we travelled about it, it is more wretched than I can possibly say. Leaving Europe was for these men not pleasurable, but in travel, the wretched is the handmaiden to the educative, and Giovanni repeatedly stressed that what he had seen with his own eyes was both veritable and instructive. Giovanni of Plano Carpini and Benedict of Poland were indefatigable travellers. They each left a written account of their journey. Giovanni's is expansive, opinionated, political, whereas Benedict's, as dictated in Cologne upon his return, is brief, discontinuous, and less individualistic in its voice. Both accounts are part of a flurry in the 1240s of Franciscan and Dominican embassies to the Mongols, during what was evidently a period of panic in Europe about Mongol military strength. In fact, the Mongols were fighting on at least 3 fronts, not only against the Christian princes of Poland, Moravia, and Hungary, but also against the Seljuks of Anatolia and the Abbasid sultans of Egypt and the Middle East. Numerous accounts of this period survive. When the Silk Roads across Asia were busy with merchants, missionaries, and ambassadors, all seeking to understand the power dynamics of a rapidly changing world. Giovanni and Benedict were unusual, but not unique. They mention how they encountered many other people on the move, merchants from Acre, Constantinople, Genoa, and Venice, envoys from Baghdad and Korea, and specific kings and princes like David VI of Georgia, 1225–93, Prince Sempad, the Constable of Armenia, 1209–76, and Grand Duke Yaroslav of Vladimir Suzdal, 1191–1246. Giovanni included an account of how Grand Duke Yaroslav was summoned to meet the Great Khan and sent home only to turn purple and then die, having been poisoned by the Khan's mother. Giovanni's journey would take him first to Batu Khan, died 1255, the Mongol founder of the massive Khanate known as the Golden Horde, and thus ruler of what is now much of Ukraine and southern Russia. The name Golden Horde refers to the wealth and magnificence of the Khan's Ordo, Mongol, camp. After visiting Batu, Giovanni passed via the Aral Sea, Lake Ulungur, and the Altai Mountains to visit Batu's cousin, the great emperor, or Khan himself, Guyuk. Giovanni and Benedict planned the journey as they travelled, gaining letters of introduction and safe conducts from the princes in the hinterland of Christian Europe. These princes also gave them supplies and beaver pelts, as the pair had been told to expect demands for tribute. In Kiev, the men discussed their intended route with local nobles. They were advised against taking their own horses due to the deep snow and the scarcity of fodder. They abandoned their horses and instead took pack horses and an escort. Riding across the long heathlands of steppe, beyond the Dnieper and over the Don, they changed their horses between 3 and 7 times a day, travelling from dawn until nightfall, and often during the night, too. The men had to bandage their limbs over and over again, owing to the strain of continual riding. They were sustained during Lent on millet mixed with water and salt. For water, they melted snow in a kettle. In the desert lands of the Kazakhs, they saw the skulls and bones of dead men scattered on the ground like manure, the remnants of unfortunate travellers who had expired as a result of the scarcity of water, or perhaps had met a worse fate. Benedict tells us that 40 beaver skins and 80 badger skins were demanded of them at Saray on the Volga. Giovanni in particular resented being ripped off as he saw it for tribute. At the end of his joyless journey were the splendours of Karakorum, the Mongol capital, from 1235 to 1260, and the first Mongol city built in the east. Karakorum was not a city in the western sense, but a huge encampment set in lushly pastured valleys, in the shadow of the peaks of the Khangai Mountains. When Giovanni visited, Karakorum was in transition from a scattered gathering of yurts to a more permanent urban settlement with a recently constructed palace. The city's population was not large, perhaps around 20,000 people, but the settlement covered a very large area, about 1,300 hectares in total, around a central walled sector and its adjacent palace complex. The population of Karakorum had been brought from elsewhere. It was an administrative and political centre, and its inhabitants included many Muslim merchants and captives from across the Mongol Empire and from places the Mongols had invaded. There were mosques and a Syriac Nestorian church where Eastern Christians, branded schismatics by Rome, worshipped both the human and divine persons of Christ as distinctive separate essences. Around this time, an enslaved French goldsmith named Guillaume Boucher, captured in Belgrade and taken to Karakorum, sculpted a metal tree fountain in Karakorum from which silver fruit and leaves hung. For the great Khan's entertainment, the tree was adorned with a trumpeting angelic automaton, which could blow its instrument at the command of the Khan's butler. The marvellous tree held conduits from which beverages, wine, kumis, mead, and rice wine, flowed to be guzzled in prodigious quantities by the great Khan's heavy-drinking court. Boucher's fountain imitated European courtly fashions for finely wrought automata, but also articulated the sense of the great Khan's power over the natural world in causing a tree to brim with beverages in the midst of this arid, wind-blown land. As Giovanni went through western Mongolia, his pace accelerated. his group hurrying to reach Karakorum in time for the long-planned coronation of Göyak Khan. Karakorum was the main court, and the celebrations for the coronation were appropriately eye-catching. Giovanni records that a huge pavilion of white velvet had been erected, big enough to hold more than 2,000 men. It was encompassed by a wooden palisade decorated with painted designs. Giovanni marveled that all the courtiers wore white velvet on the first day, red velvet on the second, when Göyak himself appeared, blue velvet on the third day, and the finest brocade on the fourth. The palisade had 2 gates, one for the great Khan alone, and the other for those admitted by armed guards. Everyone else had to stand at a distance. Giovanni's account of the various ceremonies at the Khan's court inaugurates a long tradition in Western travel writing about China, in which the ruler's courtiers are seen as if acting in a kind of servile unison, brought together through an impersonal bond of unquestioning compliance. At midday, the entire court started to drink a large quantity of kumis. Giovanni and his group refused, and they were offered mead instead, which they drank until they felt utterly sick. How frequently travellers find themselves at parties they would sooner have missed. And what kind of man did these travellers meet when they finally encountered the great Khan? The answer disappoints. None of the early travellers described the Khan in individual, human terms. Rather, they saw him as a metonym for the political and social order of the Mongol court. For Giovanni, Göyak Khan was 40 to 45 years old. In fact, he was about 30, and of medium height. The rest of his description focuses on his austere personality, very intelligent and extremely shrewd, most serious and grave in his manner, never to see and laugh for a slight cause nor to indulge in any frivolity. Giovanni offers no moral interpretation of his physiognomy or complexion, as happened so frequently when Europeans encountered other people. Rather, he saw in Göyak the rigour and order that defined his court and his state. Likewise, William of Rubruck, a garrulous Flemish missionary who met the great Khan about 8 years after Giovanni, encountered Göyak's successor, Möngke Khan, reigned 1251-9. William described Möngke as a flat-nosed man of medium height, about 45 years old. In place of appraising the great Khan himself, his eye fell on his very ugly grown-up daughter, Shirin, who it was said was mistress of all that court. He also studied the sumptuous decoration of the Khan's tent, its cloth of gold walls, and the Khan's own costume of a speckled and shiny pelt like sealskin. William's interview with Möngke became farcical. Their interpreter got utterly drunk on rice wine and stopped making sense. In a sign of his imperious majesty, Möngke ordered falcons and other birds to be brought to him, and the visitors had to watch, in silence and for a long time, as he inspected them. William had to request Möngke Khan's permission to stay at the Tatar camp until the winter had passed. But by then the great Khan himself seemed to have grown drunk, and the interpreter was completely incapacitated, so William and his group left. They were grilled for information about the West by the Khan's secretaries, further corroborating William's sense of an attack being plotted. Möngke did eventually allow William to stay at Karakorum, where he met and heard about all kinds of people connected to his life in Europe. Giovanni of Plano Carpini observed Göyak Khan's splendid coronation, which took place in a tent held up on gold-plated columns and wooden beams fastened with golden nails. The abundance of shimmering gold gave this camp the name Shira Ordo, the Yellow Camp. A huge number of people assembled there, and after midday, everyone started drinking again, non-stop until the evening. They then ate unsalted, roasted meat, sometimes with a salty broth as a sauce. Everywhere he went, the emperor had a little parasol studded with precious gems to shade him from the weather. After the coronation, Giovanni and his party were effectively imprisoned for a month in the household of the great Khan's mother. Giovanni was told that the Khan intended to raise his banner against the whole of the Western world and wished to keep his papal visitors ignorant of his plans. While they waited, Giovanni, who paid a great deal of attention to how much food he could get, and his companions were given a tiny amount to eat and drink, enduring such hunger and thirst that we could scarcely keep alive. In the end, a kindly Russian goldsmith named Kozma, one of several European craftsmen at the Khan's court, helped the visitors with a little sustenance. They were eventually freed and given a permit to depart and a letter bearing the emperor's seal. Khan's mother gave them a fox-skin cloak and a bolt of velvet. Her courtiers stole bits of the velvet. Giovanni says, "This did not escape our notice, but we preferred not to make a fuss about it." In strange lands, the traveller often has to let things go that would otherwise be cause for serious complaint. The Great Khan's letter, dated Jamada 2nd, 644, late November 1246, was copied into Benedict's account. In it, the Khan reminded the Pope that any god was clearly on the Mongols' side, for it was they who had destroyed the whole earth from the east to the west in the power of God. How, he asked, could this be contrary to God? He pointed out that Christian princes had not obeyed his predecessors and boldly told the Pope to commit to peace with him, a submission he would generously understand. If the Pope refused to submit, the Khan threatened that he would know him as an enemy. After that, we do not know what will happen. God alone knows, he warned. The long journey had been a success insofar as the friars had opened a communication with the Mongol court, but the consequence was further threats of violence and a clear articulation of imperial rivalry. Travellers to the Mongol East had read of strange rumours about what lay off the beaten track. They were led to believe there were cannibals and rat-eaters, dog-headed peoples and axe-wielding warriors, wool-bearing bushes and snow raspberries, millions of mice, but an incomprehensible absence of pigs, living, breeding diamonds, multiplying in the rocks, customs around death and burial that were unmentionable. Many people identified somewhere in this region a fountain of youth, whose waters in some accounts restored youth to the drinker or gave eternal life. The fountain could also offer beauty, and sometimes discriminated by race, turning dark skin white. But these were just travellers' tales. As he made his way across the Tatar steppe, Benedict of Poland noticed the huge amount of wormwood growing there, its feathery leaves spreading across the cold flatlands. As he rode, he remembered from reading long before in a frigid cloister somewhere in Europe, a remark by Ovid in his epistles, "The bitter wormwood shivers in the endless plains." It seemed to speak directly to Benedict across time and space. The truth of travel often erupts in such buried memories, where one's past asserts itself in surprising moments, as thoughts from home appear at the ends of the world. Giovanni of Plano Carpini and Benedict of Poland were unusually intrepid, but by about 1300, a significant number of Europeans had settled and formed communities in large cities in what we now call China. The papal emissary Giovanni del Marlignoni, who visited from Italy circa 1346, observed 3 Franciscan churches in Zayton, Kanzu, as well as a fondaco for the visiting European merchants. Europeans in China were usually there for trade or missionary activity. Far from being an unknown and unknowable empire, China became the destination for a surprisingly large number of European travellers. Key testimonies include those of the Franciscan missionaries William of Rubruck in 1253 and Odoric of Pordenone, the merchant Marco Polo, who was in China for much of the 1280s and 1290s, the letters from Giovanni of Montecorvino, sometime Archbishop of Carmbalic, Peregrine, Bishop of Zayton, 1318, and Andrew of Perugia, circa 1313, as well as the account of the wonders of China and India by the missionary Jordan of Severac. As this list suggests, writing and reading about the Far East became an established genre. These accounts were copied into Latin encyclopedic text and world histories as Western audiences lusted for knowledge about the magnificence of the great Khan's court and his almost boundless power. China was conventionally divided by Europeans into the provinces of Cathay and Manzi. Cathay referred to the upper northern region, and Manzi the southern region. Confusingly, Manzi was also called by some Europeans Upper India. It was previously ruled by the Song dynasty. From the 1260s, the Mongol Empire fragmented, with various dynasties setting up their own rival khanates. From 1271 to 1368, most of what is now China and Mongolia was ruled by the Yuan regime, a Mongol dynasty that ranked non-Chinese foreigners above Chinese and established a favourable environment for European settlers and visitors. The Yuan dynasty moved the Mongol capital from Karakorum to Chengdu, Xanadu, and then to Carmbalic, now Beijing. Carmbalic served as the winter capital and the Yuan administrative centre. The Turkic Mongol name Carmbalic means something like permanent urban settlement, but it was also called Dadu from Tatu, the Mandarin for Great Capital. Buddhism was the de facto religion, although there was considerable religious pluralism. In 1368, the Yuan were conquered by the Ming, a Han Chinese dynasty, and the capital moved to Nanjing, the southern capital. Although this was demoted to secondary capital in 1403, and Khan Balik Dadu's primacy restored. The Ming renamed the city Beiping, meaning the pacified north. Behave like a local. As you enter each Tatar lordship or each province of Cathay, you'll be expected to give a tribute of food and or drink. Kumis, fermented mare's milk, and wind-dried smoked meats are generally appreciated. Across Tatari, people wear furs and animal skins. In Cathay, it can be extremely cold in April and May, and you may want to dress like the great Khan's courtiers in sheepskin cloaks, sheepskin trousers, and sheepskin shoes. To Western travellers, Khan Balik was more recognisable than Karakoram as a great city, and its splendours were written about in superlative terms. In contrast to Karakoram, Khan Balik had an identifiable city centre. At its heart was the complex known as the Imperial City, what is now known as the Forbidden City, built in the 15th century, refers to part of this complex. The Imperial City was an elaborate landscaped parkland of pavilions, towers, halls, barracks, temples, warehouses, artificial mounds and residential palaces, set alongside sparkling lakes and bridges. This was, according to the reports sent back to the West, the matchless expression of the great Khan's power and wealth, technological sophistication, and love of ordered beauty. Perhaps the most famous traveller of the Middle Ages, and certainly the best-known visitor to pre-Ming China, was Marco Polo, the voluble, if pedantic, prosaic, and unreliable Venetian merchant. Polo was not an explorer. His famous travels took place across established merchants' networks, and he was less a traveller than an expatriate migrant worker. He first set out for China in 1271, aged 17, from his family's house in Venice via Acre, accompanied by his father Niccolo and uncle Maffeo, both of them experienced merchants who had already in the 1260s traversed much of Asia. The Polo family were representative of the Venetian world of the Black Sea, trading in jewels and other commodities between Venice and the ascendant westward-moving Mongol Empire. The Polo men spent some 17 years serving in Kublai Khan's administration. Marco Polo seems to have been a gifted linguist, able to negotiate across the various nations trading with the Mongols, and he was also involved in the salt industry. He returned to Europe in the mid-1290s. We know about Polo principally through the book he co-wrote, properly called The Description of the World. This was composed in French in a Genoese prison, a co-production between Polo and his fellow inmate, the Romance writer Rocchicello of Pisa, died circa 1300. Both men were held for ransom in the wars between Genoa and Venice. Polo was released and returned to Venice around 1299 and lived out his years as a wealthy merchant and famous author-traveller. He died in 1324, around the age of 70. Despite its wide readership, The Description of the World is a work of political geography more than a travel narrative. As a travel guide, it lacks the sense of individual observation or distinctive voice of other early travellers to the Far East. For many pages, Polo's travels are presented in earnest literal terms, listing currencies, commodities, bureaucratic rules, and second-hand miracles. Still, his book was hungrily read in Europe for evidence of the burgeoning world of the East. By the 1280s, when Polo visited Khan Balik, it was a well-established city where Arabs, Persians, Nepalese, Tibetans, Uyghurs, and many others worked for the glory of, or in servitude to, the great Khan. Polo was kept in the Khan's service, an exalted vassal, but Beijing, the city he called Taidu, or Khanbalak, was for him a wonderland which stimulated his capacity for description. Polo said the imperial city at Khanbalak was the largest palace he ever seen, a palace so immense and so finely wrought that there is not a man on earth who could imagine improving on its design and construction, even if he had the power to do so. For Polo, the palace was the supreme articulation of the Khan's power and sophistication, and his account of it reflects the gawping wonder of an awestruck tourist. The complex was housed within a great square wall, a mile long on each side, completely white and battlemented. At each corner were sited large palaces of great beauty and opulence that were used as arsenals for the great Khan's munitions. As at Karakoram, there was a gate that opened for none but the Khan himself. Internal walls made of marble 2 paces thick formed a kind of terrace where people could stroll and survey the entire area, looking out of the imperial city at those not allowed in. An exquisite pillared balustrade was a meeting place for the court, and a great flight of marble steps led up to the Khan's own palace. This palace was a feast for hungry eyes, its wall completely covered with gold and silver and decorated with elaborate reliefs, dragons, birds, knights, battles, and all kinds of beasts. The ceiling was similarly dazzling, bearing pictures made in gold. The palace was built round a gigantic hall so vast and wide that more than 6,000 men could easily eat there. The extent of the palace and its many rooms was, for Polo, quite bewildering. There were treasuries for all the great Khan's precious gems and gold, and large houses and halls for his wives and concubines. Everything, said Polo, was arranged for the Khan's comfort and convenience, and outsiders are not admitted. A sly suggestion that Polo had himself become an insider. Around the palace were wooded parklands, where beautiful deer and squirrels sported in meadows lush with grass. Paved roads ran through the glades, irrigating and draining the lawns. Just beyond the palace was a man-made hill 100 paces high, about 75 metres. The hill was planted as the Khan's arboretum. Polo reported that whenever someone mentions a beautiful tree to the great Khan, he orders it pulled up with its roots and a quantity of earth and transported by elephants to this mound. The hill, called the Green Hill, contained the most beautiful trees in the world, and was always green. Some said that it was covered in green lapis lazuli to make it evergreen. The hill had been built by the great Khan for the sake of the beautiful view it gave of the imperial city, an impressive sight for all who were able to experience it. Around the hills were fish ponds and conduits, all for the Khan's enjoyment, and swans and waterfowl. Polo, an eyewitness and repeated visitor to the court, little appreciated nature, but loved contrivance and sophisticated trickery. For him, travel was about noting new technologies and wonders, an account of all that wasn't available at home. At the northern extent of the new Mongol city were the Drum Tower and the Bell Tower built by Kublai Khan in 1272. The Drum Tower marked daybreak with a rhythmic beat resounding from its impressive stories. The Bell Tower rang out the end of the day and marked the point at which an unofficial curfew started. Both towers, high, tiered, ingeniously decorated, used imposing architecture and public music to keep time and order, and to announce the great Khan's control over Khanbalik and its inhabitants' lives. Polo's account is unusual and important because it also gives a brief description of the city outside the imperial precincts. Khanbalik was a new planned city, according to Polo, and the population had moved there from the old city, except those who harboured rebellious intentions. They were left behind. The new city measured almost 40 kilometres in perimeter, built within a perfect square of crenellated walls. Within, the whole city was laid out as a grid of straight, broad streets, like a chessboard. Palaces, inns and houses were constructed in measured plots, each in a courtyard off the finely built public roads. Polo described here the characteristic hutong lanes of old Beijing. The whole place, for Polo, was so beautiful and skillfully planned that no description can do it justice. There is no sense in his account of Khanbalik of anything other than admiration for the great Khan's capital, an articulation of power and order, and a place beyond words. Yet, for all his proximity to the Khan, Polo was speaking to a Western audience, imparting a specialist knowledge based on experience. His account of Khanbalik holds within it the imprecise but vivid archaeology of a lived memory. The city's status as a hub for vast numbers of merchants and foreigners was reflected, for Polo, in the number of its sinful women. He assured his readers that at least 20,000 sex workers who discreetly lived in Khanbalik's suburbs serviced men for money. They were all needed, he said prurently, to satisfy the vast numbers of merchants and foreigners who come and go here every day. Moreover, they paid no tax, instead offering sexual services to state officials. Polo himself, at once merchant, foreigner and employee of the great Khan, may well have had first-hand experience of Khanbalik's sex workers. A few generations later, reports of the imperial city had become the stuff of legend. John Mandeville summarised the European idea of Khan Balik in his book, itself based on Odoric of Pordenon's description from his 3-year stay there in the 1320s. Mandeville called the city Kadam, a corruption of Dadu. It had, he said, walls that were 20 miles in circumference and contained 12 gates. The whole place was so richly arrayed that it defied comparison. The gardens were elegant and held a fine mountain that was the prettiest to be found anywhere. The palace walls were covered with red panther pelts, which exuded a pleasant smell and shimmered in the sun so one can hardly look at them. There were never foul stinks there, and these panther skins were valued like gold. The married women wore on their heads the image of a man's foot, cleverly crafted in gems and peacock feathers. This signified their subjection to their husbands. The emperor's throne and hall were bedecked with jewels and gems repetitively listed by Mandeville. He writes that the Mongol court was more magnificent and splendid than we had ever heard. We would never have believed it if we hadn't seen it. There is a tease here, because he hadn't seen it, but the reports of the imperial city were so impressive that they were, essentially, incredible. By Mandeville's time, the organisation of the imperial palace was designed to reflect the Western idea of the great Khan's potent perfection, a cosmic order in which the palace represented the supreme being of the Khan himself. Some years after Giovanni of Plano Carpini and Benedict of Poland's journey, on the 8th of January 1305, Giovanni of Montecorvino wrote a letter from Khan Balik to the Minister General of the Franciscan Order in Italy. Giovanni was also a Franciscan, born in southern Italy, and with a long career as a missionary in Armenia and Tabriz. By 1305, he had constructed a Christian church in Khan Balik, baptized about 6,000 people into the Christian faith, educated dozens of local boys in Latin and Greek, and copied out 30 psalters and 2 breviaries in manuscript so the local community could perform religious services. He had learned to speak the Mongols' language and even translated the New Testament into it. It seems to have been a largely solitary existence for him as a Latin Christian in Khan Balik. In his letter, he called for reinforcements. He needed more books and 2 or 3 comrades who could help him missionize. He was confident that he could convert the great Khan himself. At this point, Temur Khan died 1307, the grandson of Kublai Khan and great-great-grandson of Genghis Khan. Giovanni of Montecorvino had much experience as a missionary and set about converting both the people and the built environment of Khan Balik. He had built a church with a 3-belled campanile and in 1305 was busy trying to establish a second church. He blamed the labours and tribulations of his experiences in Tartary for turning his hair white at the age of 58. He was evidently committed to his mission, but his letter ends on a familiar, awestruck note. There is no king or prince in the world who can equal the great Khan in the extent of his land and the greatness of the population and wealth. Time and again, we find in Western reports an image of China as truly an awesome empire, with Europe and the Roman Church no match for it. Later, Giovanni of Montecorvino successfully converted a Mongol prince, George, apparently a Nestorian and Confucian who became Catholic, but did not renounce Confucianism, and helped to build a cruciform church in the lost town of Tenduk. Giovanni had no such success with Temur Khan, whose Buddhism, which Giovanni called idolatry, was securely established. Giovanni recommended the safest and quickest route to China. A friar, accompanied by a courier, could make the journey in 5 or 6 months if they travelled through the lands of the northern Tatars. This route started at Tana, passed the Black Sea, and went via the western Mongol capital at Saray on the Volga, and then across what is now Kazakhstan. The alternative route, Giovanni warned, was very long and very dangerous, for it involved 2 sea voyages. It would take more than 2 years, and was, he said, the equivalent of sailing first from Acre to Provence, and then again from Acre to England. The sea route was via Hormuz to the Malabar coast, and then from St. Thomas's, Mylapore near Chennai, on the east coast of India to China. And yet the land route he recommended had been closed for a considerable time because of wars taking place, and it seems that Giovanni was obliged to go by sea. His letter is part of a body of European knowledge about how best, despite the rigours of the journey, to bridge the space between Europe and the amazing court of the great Khan. A few years later, in 1338, Yet another Franciscan friar named Giovanni de Marignoli, a high-ranking Florentine churchman at the papal court, was sent by the Pope to the court of the Great Khan. 3 years after leaving Avignon, and after having passed through the Gobi Desert, Giovanni reached Khanbalik in the summer of 1342. Khanbalik was indescribable. Of its incredible size, population, and military array we will say nothing, but it is clear from the brief description he gave that he and his party of 31 fellow travellers were treated extremely well by the Great Khan, given liberal quantities of meat and drink, paper for lanterns, and costly raiment. Giovanni reached a personal request from the Khan that he himself should become Archbishop of Khanbalik, at the cathedral at the palace's gate, as built by Giovanni of Montecorvino in 1305. Among the many places visited by Marco Polo was the large and splendid city of Jiangsu, often called Yangzhou. Jiangsu, sited on a plain, thrived where the remarkable Grand Canal, running for over 1,000 kilometers from Beijing to Hangzhou, met the wide waters of the Yangtze River. Shallow lakes and slender canals wove through the city. Junks and sampans slipped downstream, fueled by human sweat. The canals were crossed by carved bridges, each splendidly ornamented. Tiered Buddhist pagodas, with their gently tapering flanks, gave the city an elegant, elaborate skyline. According to his account, Polo did not just pass through Jiangsu, but spent 3 years there. He reported that the residents practiced idolatry and spoke the Persian tongue. He then claimed that he had been appointed governor of the city by the Great Khan's commission. This, he said, made him one of the Khan's 12 highest-ranking barons. Polo's boast is not to be believed. He is not attested in Chinese sources. It is possible that the word sojourner, stayed, became corrupted in manuscripts to seigneur, governed. It is not unusual for travellers to think of themselves as being in charge rather than passing visitors. Such travellers' unreliabilities aside, all travellers are subjective. Jiangsu was one of the key destinations for European visitors, and Polo was unlikely to have been the only European there. When Odoric of Pordenone visited Jiangsu in 1332-3, the city had a Franciscan convent and 3 other Nestorian churches, following the Eastern Syriac Christian rite. There had long been a Persian merchant community in Jiangsu, trading between China and Hormuz. At the same time, Genoese and Venetian expatriate merchant communities were established there. We know that one of the families living in Jiangsu at this time was that of Domenico Ilioni. The Ilioni family from Genoa had established itself in Persia, probably at Tabriz in the 13th century, and then moved to Jiangsu. 2 tombstones unearthed in the city reveal something of the lives and deaths of Domenico's children. Caterina died 1342, and Antonia died 1344. Caterina's beautifully preserved tombstone is inscribed in Latin in Gothic lettering, with carved line drawings of the martyrdom of her namesake, St. Catherine of Alexandria, alongside angels and a Madonna and a child. Antonia's less well-preserved stone likewise shows conventional Christian imagery of the Last Judgment and the martyrdom of his patron saint, St. Anthony the Abbot. These images seem at first to express familiar memories of European religious culture imported from Italy. However, their style is not European, but more like Chinese Buddhist art of the time, and it is possible that the stonemason was a local convert to Christianity, or simply a commercial artist. Moreover, the execution of St. Catherine is dressed as a Mongol warrior, retranslating the saint's story from west to east. The Ilioni family had travelled physically almost as far from Europe as they could, but remained closely connected to their origins through the trading of goods like silks and spices. From Jiangsu to Tabriz, to the Genoese colony at Pera in Constantinople, and back to Genoa and beyond. Their gravestones reveal the entangled world of a syncretic global city, linking Western Europe with the Far East, via caravanserais of the Silk Roads and merchants' junks across the Indian Ocean. Through articulating their deaths in stone monuments, Caterina and Antonio Ilioni left a lasting testimony to the interconnected world of which they were part, in which travel and contact over enormous distances kept East and West in constant interplay. And what was beyond China? To the east lay the realm of Cipangu, or Japan, only loosely apprehended by European travellers in our period. On Beheim's globe of 1491, Sipangu is a long archipelago illustrated with a regal tent, the sign of a king, and notes on its nutmeg and pepper forests. The description of the archipelago is minimal. Sipangu has a king and its own language. Its inhabitants worship idols. There is much gold there and a rich yield of spicery. This information is taken from Marco Polo, usually credited as the bearer of the first account of the Japanese Empire to reach the West. Polo's description set the template for European notions of Japan for about 300 years. Even Polo did not pretend to have travelled to Japan. He had clearly heard about the kingdom during his time in Mongol China, which had launched significant but unsuccessful attacks on Japan in 1274 and 1281. He had been told that Japan was inhabited by white, good-looking and courteous people, exceedingly rich in gold and completely independent. Repeating a rumour that was often made by travellers around Asia, Polo said that the people were cannibals, killing captives and eating their cooked flesh for a family meal. There were yet worse exploits of these idolaters that he had heard of, but they were so outlandish and diabolical that they are not fit to be mentioned in our book because such wickedness would be too much for Christian ears. This marks the limit of Polo's information. He knew little else about Japan, and his account of the country avoids factual or cultural specificity. Japanese curiosities, he noted, included a huge palace entirely covered with fine gold and a notable Japanese burial custom, according to which the dead were burned or buried, those that were buried having a local pearl put in their mouth. The rest of his account comprises a sensationalized story about the calamitous 1281 Mongol invasion of Japan, which occurred during his service at Kublai Khan's court. He would therefore have been on the scene as reports of the failed invasion came back to Khan Balik. It is also one of the few moments in his book when Polo talks about the practicalities and perils of travel itself. The Mongol fleet set off from Zaitun, Kanzu, and Xingzai, Hangzhou, two of the most important imperial ports in eastern China. The latter conquered by the Mongols in 1276. The fleet was led by two rival captains, Abakan, the Mongol chief Arakan, and Von Sain-Chin, the Song defector Fan Wenhu, whose mutual enmity doomed the expedition from the outset. The fleet reached Japan, but before a single parapet or postern could be taken, a northerly gale blew in. Seeing that they would be wrecked if they remained in harbour, the Mongol fleet put to sea. Once they were out in the turbulent waters, the gale intensified, and the ships started to collide and shatter. Thousands drowned, others escaped, if their boat was able to navigate through the awful seas. Some ships, including those that held the two commanders, managed to land at a small, uninhabited island. Once the storm had abated, the commanders gathered all the officers and captains, that is, the senior noblemen in the fleet, and fled back to China. They left 30,000 mariners abandoned on the small island, shipwrecked and desolate. A short time later, the Japanese invaded this island, planning to seize the miserable shipmen whose own commanders had left them for dead. But according to the story, Polo was told, some of the Chinese men outwitted the Japanese and were able to sneak around a mountain and board the Japanese fleet. They stole the boats, sailed to Japan, and were taken for Japanese sailors and welcomed to the capital city, which they promptly seized. Historically speaking, this would have been Kyoto. They chased out all the people except for some good-looking women whom they kept to serve them, and held the city for 7 months. They surrendered only when they were guaranteed that their lives would be spared. Meanwhile, the Chinese commanders who had made it back to the Great Khan's court were executed. Polo's description of Japan as a place of limitless merchandise ripe for plunder, stuffed with gold and pearls, echoes the other medieval wonderlands of the Far East. A vaguely understood dominion of boundless wealth, ready for the intrepid merchant traveller to make their fortune. Polo's spirited account, presented as recent news of the failed Mongol attack, has at its centre that most medieval image of changing fortune, the storm or tempest. The tempest was long a favoured image for describing the perils of rapaciousness and the vicissitudes of man's journey in life. The violent sea change which caused the stern to rise and the prow to fall, which plunged powerless mortals into the blinding waves of its depth, which moved the fleet's straight course to chaos through an uncontrollable will. The tempest's squalls caught all aware or unaware, and they could only curse the power of their gods. In Polo's telling, the storm alone hindered the Chinese, the leveller of ambition and the limiter of travel, and as such was the boundary, a natural boundary, of the great Khan's empire, where conflicting winds brought even the greatest of worldly powers to frustration. Polo's version of events in 1281 is not historically accurate. It reflects face-saving on the part of the defeated Chinese, and aspects of his story are directly contradicted in contemporary Chinese and Japanese sources. Arakan had in fact died before reaching Japan and was replaced by Atakai as commander-in-chief. The occupation of Kyoto is fantastical. The Mongol fleet harried Takashima where the dreadful typhoon struck. The Japanese removed the surviving Chinese to Hakata, Fukuoka, where Mongol, Korean, and Han soldiers were executed. Others were imprisoned or enslaved. 3 survivors made their way back to Khan Balik to relate what had befallen the great Khan's fleet, and their testimony was used in Fan Wenhu's court-martial at Khan Balik, in which he was found guilty of abandoning his troops on the islands off Kyushu. Almost all medieval travel writing makes clear that no one has seen the whole world. The truth or reliability of Polo's account of Japan little mattered to his European audience, because Japan was terra nullius as far as Western understanding went. It was yet another abundant place among the strange isles of the East. For all his long-distance travels and his many years spent in Asia, Polo was unsure about the extent of the world, and certain that there remained yet further worlds to be visited, discovered, and profited from. Eating out in Mongol China. Marco Polo is often credited with bringing a range of foods from China to Italy, but there is no evidence he brought recipes back with him. He did note many peculiarities of diet and rituals around food. For example, he described excellent spiced date wine in Hormuz, the exclusive diet of meat and rice in Kashmir, the Tatar habit of eating horse, dog, and mongoose, the Central Asian offerings of fat and broth to the gods, the rice and millet noodles of China, and the wonderful pears and peaches at the Hangzhou market. The encounter with other diets, dining conventions, and social taboos around food is a perennial part of travel. In general, travellers focused on curiosities or rules of dining rather than the preparation of food, and were impressed by the great plenty of food in medieval China. Here follow some medieval rules about dining and hospitality in a ger, yurt, in Mongol China. When an animal is to be eaten, you should truss its legs up, cut open the belly, and squeeze the heart tight in your hand until the animal dies. After this, you can eat the meat. Whoever slaughters an animal in the Muslim fashion will himself be slaughtered. Genghis Khan prohibited the dipping of your hands in water. Water should instead be scooped with vessels. Genghis Khan forbade his subjects to eat food offered by another until the one offering the food had tasted it himself, even if you're an emir and the other a captive. He forbade anyone to eat anything in the presence of another without first having invited him to share the food. He forbade any man to eat more than his comrades, and to step over a fire on which food was being cooked, or a dish from which people were eating. When a traveller passes a group of people eating, he should get down from his horse and eat with them without asking permission, and they must not hinder him in this. If kumis is not offered to the thirsty, you shall pay a fine of 1 sheep. If you refuse to offer a traveller shelter for the night, you might be fined a 3-year-old mare. You must not use a knife to remove meat from a cooking pot, as this will take the head off the flame. You must not urinate inside a yurt. If you do this voluntarily, you'll be put to death. If it's accidental, you'll have to pay a sorcerer to cleanse you, and the yurt, and all that's in it, by passing through 2 fires. And before it's purified, no one should dare enter it or remove anything from it. The theft of mare's milk, wine, and tea will be punished by a fine of 5 head of cattle. The theft of grain will be punished by a fine of 1 horse. You must not pour milk or put any other food or drink on the ground. A person who chokes on food must be driven out of the yurt and killed at once. If a piece of food is given to anyone and he puts it in his mouth but doesn't eat it and spits it out, a hole will be made beneath the yurt and he shall be drawn out into the hole and killed mercilessly. If you can't stop drinking alcohol, get drunk only 3 times a month. If you exceed this, you'll be punished. Getting drunk twice a month is good, and once a month is even better. What could be better than not drinking at all? But who on earth can do that? If such a person were to be found, he would be worthy of the highest praise. 13. Visiting the West. Istanbul, 1470. Hormuz and Jeddah, 1413–15. Peterborough, 1393. Jerusalem, 1325–7. Poitiers, 1307. Bordeaux and Paris, 1288. Many people outside Europe, if they thought about Europe at all, thought of it as the land of the Romans, the land of the Franks, or the Latin Empire, far from the main centres of the world's population. In the period 1300 to 1400, the world's biggest cities were likely Beijing and Nanjing, each with over 500,000 people, compared to Rome's 33,000, London's 50,000, and Paris's 200,000. All these figures are approximations. So far, this book has largely focused on the touristic eye and I of European travellers going east. It has foregrounded their curiosity, their prejudices, their desires, their tendencies to exoticize, and the ways their reports and opinions shaped their world. We now rotate the globe a little in order to consider how the West looked to Eastern travellers and visitors. To do this topic justice would take many more volumes. Here I offer a few perspectives as a corrective to the West's dominant gaze, a gaze that did so much to construct the idea of travel with which we now live. We started our journey with Beheim's Globe, which presented the view of the world from Nuremberg. We now take a different view from Istanbul, sometime Constantinople, sometime Byzantium, in the 1470s, 50 years after Bertrand de la Brocquière's mission there. Since 1453, the city had come under the rule of the Ottoman Emperor Mehmed II, aka Mehmed the Conqueror. Its population, its visual aspect, and its global orientation had fundamentally changed. Mehmed II conquered Constantinople in May 1453. He was aged just 21 at the time. His forces killed the Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI Dragasis Palaiologos 1405–53, effectively ending a Christian empire which could be traced back to ancient Rome. All over Europe, kings and churchmen reacted with shock and horror to what they saw as a victory of Islam over Christendom. The Ottoman troops were granted the prize of 3 days of looting. On the 3rd day, Mehmed held a victory celebration, guaranteed safety to the remaining Christians, and set about transforming the city. The Basilica of Hagia Sophia became a mosque, and Mehmed swiftly moved his capital from Edirne to Constantinople, which began to be called Istanbul, its popular Turkish name, derived from the Greek Istenpolon, to or in the city. In 1459, Mehmed began having a magnificent palace, Topkapi, built for him. From his private quarters in Topkapi's shaded hilltop precincts, the Sultan could look over the Golden Horn, his gaze commanding the sea routes east to the Black Sea and west to the Aegean and the Mediterranean. Mehmed made it no secret that he wished to conquer Rome, just as he had taken the new Rome of Constantinople. From his elaborate palace at Topkapi, he declared himself Kayseri Rum, literally a new Caesar of the Romans. Sultan Mehmed had cosmopolitan tastes, bridging East and West, part Islamic faith, conqueror, part Renaissance prince. He amassed books and artworks from the territories he conquered, and he wanted to view the world through the eyes of those he had vanquished, the Venetian navigators and merchants who had previously dominated the Mediterranean. He commissioned a wide range of maps of different perspectives and geographical approaches. In particular, Mehmed seems to have had Turkish cartographers make a large number of Islamic maps, including several drawn into copies of Abu Ishaq al-Istakri's Kitab al-Masalik, The Roots of the Realm, a hugely influential 10th century geographical work. Mehmed had these maps in his personal possession and put them in Istanbul's mosque libraries too. On these maps, south is at the top, north is at the bottom. What is now Iraq is at the map's centre. 2 main continents dominate: Africa in the south, top half, Asia in the north, bottom. The maps are bisected by the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. Ottoman territory is marked as the land of the Rum, the Muslim empire of Anatolia, and most of continental Europe is marked optimistically as the land of Greater Byzantium, a Greater Turkey. Christian Europe is just a small slice of the northwest bottom right corner, where a tiny territory is marked as Franks, Western Europe. To its right, west, is Al-Andalus, the Islamic Emirates of southern Iberia until Castile's conquest of Granada in 1492. Christian Europe is, according to this worldview, an obscure corner lacking in detail or notable features. From Istanbul, Western Europe was at the edge of the world. In other words, in some maps from Mehmed's Istanbul, the values and perspectives of European maps are shifted about, a different world, a world of difference. In the summer of 1480, Ottoman Turkish forces besieged the southern Italian city of Otranto, then part of the Kingdom of Naples. The Ottomans were making unprecedented incursions in the west, including their siege of Rhodes in the same year, and raids and landings throughout the Mediterranean. At the same time, European-style maps were being made for the Ottoman court by one of the most famous cartographers in Western Europe, Francesco Berlinghieri, 1440 to 1501, of Florence. Berlinghieri used the ancient Geographica of Ptolemy, circa 150 CE, a Greek treatise on world cartography that became widely translated into Latin around 1400. The Geographica mapped and described the world from the islands of the Atlantic to the eastern coast of China. Berlinghieri updated Ptolemy by translating the work into Italian poetry and adding cartographic detail. Berlinghieri's maps, dazzlingly decorated in lapis lazuli and gold leaf, show all of Europe, its coasts and rivers and cities. One can see Canterbury, Canterbury, Londra, London, and Exestria, Exeter in England, Rossel, La Rochelle, Bordeaux, Bordeaux, and Bayonne, Bayonne on the Atlantic coast. The place names of the map tend to be ports or ecclesiastical centres. Scandinavia is largely absent, and the Baltic is crudely sketched, but the Atlantic and Mediterranean littorals are shown in great detail and with startling accuracy. Berlinghieri's book was designed for Mehmed, but Mehmed died before it could be completed. A magnificent copy of the book with its painted maps was presented in 1482 to Mehmed's son, Bayezid II, ruled 1481 to 1512. Islamic crescents are marked in the elegant margins where other copies have the Christian cross. This atlas was a curious counterpart to other maps in the Ottoman collection, most of which foregrounded the Persian and Indian Ocean world. Berlinghieri's map extended Turkish knowledge of the West and allowed the new Sultan to look west with a Western view, using the latest Italian geographical knowledge presented in Italian poetry. Just as Christian Europe had gradually taken an interest in the wider world, the world beyond Europe developed an interest in the West. Good to know. Camels are used for travel in many parts of the world. Some people say there are two types of camel, the Bactrian and the Arabian. The Arabian camel, or dromedary, has one hump on its back. The Bactrian has two, although some say it's the other way around. People ride, load, and eat camels, and one can wear camel skin or use it for leather tenting. Cameline, or camlet, is a soft Asian wool made from camel hair. The herder of camels is called the dromedarius, or cameleer. Camels and dromedaries run fast. They have hot, acrid, thin blood, so their milk is thinner than that of other beasts. It is clear that China was for a long time connected with the Far West, both via the Silk routes and by the maritime trade routes to the eastern coast of Africa, the Horn of Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. Medieval Chinese coins have been found as far afield as England and Ethiopia. It was well known by the 1470s that men from Cathay had travelled eastwards, and there were even reports that two strange and wonderful Chinese had appeared in Galway in Ireland, reflecting the belief that there was a direct sea passage between eastern China and Western Europe. Such anecdotes can be dismissed as strange rumours and misunderstandings. Perhaps these blow-ins in Ireland were from Iceland, Greenland, or North America. However, we do have much more detailed and certain records of Chinese travellers in the Far West from earlier in the 15th century, during precisely that time when European travel was also expanding rapidly. Zheng He, Cheng Ho, 1371 to 1435, was a high-ranking eunuch, a castrated official at the Ming court. Between 1405 and 1433, he undertook 7 massive seaborne expeditions, sailing through the oceans to bring back treasure in the form of tribute, plunder, ambassadors, new merchandise, and women for the imperial court. Each of the expeditions led by Zheng He comprised thousands of mariners and traversed the widest extent of the Chinese world, from Southeast Asia to East Africa. His fleet, built and maintained in the massive imperial dockyards at Nanjing, comprised stupendously large vessels, at least 90 meters in length and with 9 masts. There were horse ships carrying the cavalry, water tankers for holding drinking water, supply ships full of food, and dozens of smaller vessels. On 3 of his voyages, Zheng He was accompanied by a voluble translator and travel writer named Ma Huan, pen-named Mountain Woodcutter. Both Zheng He and Ma Huan were Muslims, and their voyages were partly framed as pilgrimages to the land of the heavenly square, that is, Mecca. Ma Huan was also an observant and curious travel writer. His first journey with Zheng He in 1413 to 15 was a remarkable voyage comprising 63 ships and over 28,500 men, which sailed out of Nanjing to Java, Sri Lanka, the Malabar coast, including Cochin and Calicut, and as far west as Hormuz and Aden. In his foreword, written in 1416, to his account of that journey, Ma Huan described how his curiosity had initially been piqued by reading a 14th century geographical text, an account of the islands and their barbarians. He wrote that, after reading about the various peoples, topographies, and climates of the planet, he asked himself, how can there be such dissimilarities in the world? Like many Western travel writers who set off their journeys both to research and to confirm what they had already encountered in others' accounts of the world, Ma Huan used the massive voyage to see with his own eyes the places he had read about and to walk them in person. And thus he knew that written descriptions of the world were no fabrications, and that even greater wonders existed. He said little about the practicalities of travel. Rather, his method was to collect notes on the ugliness and handsomeness of the people he encountered in each country, about local customs, about products and merchandise, and about boundaries and jurisdictions. In his foreword, he described himself as a mere simpleton, privileged as he was to accompany the imperial envoy on such a journey, and spoke of the voyage as a wonderful opportunity, the kind that occurs only once in 1,000 years. He finished the foreword with an assurance to the reader that he was incapable of literary elegances, and so his honest pen could be trusted. Ma Huan emerges through his account as at once precise and inquisitive, keen to record the world in detail but also full of desire for new wonders, an oscillation between the travel writer's wish to be accurate in what they saw and their desire to convey the world's marvellousness. One of the tasks of the journey was to capture a usurper to the throne of Samudera, a sultanate on Sumatra's northern tip. But Ma Huan says little about the military logistics of the venture. His inquiring eye and taste for the detail of local cultures is quite at odds with what must have been the shockingly bellicose appearance of the fleet with which he sailed and the assertive expansion which lay behind the Ming dynasty's international journeys. Ma Huan's extraordinary account of the world covers many pages and includes a great deal of fascinating detail, ranging from a lyrical poem on his great ship's progress on the roaring waves of the boundless ocean, to an account of Malacan were-tigers, tigers who turn into men, and to the lists of the wines of Sri Lanka and the 10 uses of Indian coconuts. Namely, according to Ma Huan, 1. Sweet sap, a beverage. 2. Wine fermented from the sap. 3. Coconut oil from the coconut flesh. 4. Sugar from the coconut. 5. Food from the flesh. 6. Coconut fibre for making rope for shipbuilding. 7. Coconut shells for making bowls and cups. 8. Coconut ash for inlaying gold or silver. 9. Coconut trees for building. 10. Coconut leaves for roofing houses. The northwesternmost point visited by Ma Huan was Jeddah, the port for Mecca, on the western side of the Arabian Peninsula. He also visited several ports in East Africa. Jeddah was a major commercial port in its own right and a western terminus of most Indian and Chinese shipping. Ma Huan gave only a brief description of the town and its stalwart and fine-looking people, their very dark purple skin, and the pacific and admirable customs of the residents. There are no poverty-stricken families, he wrote, and they all observe the precepts of their religion. and lawbreakers are few. Admiringly, he added, "It is in truth a most happy country," before making his journey to Mecca and its heavenly hall, where he gave a description of the wonderfully built mosque. Its walls, he recounted, were formed of clay mixed with rosewater and ambergris, giving out perpetual fragrance. He described the heavenly square of Mecca in the familiar terms of the earthly paradise, a place of architectural ingenuity, social ease, and natural pleasure. Marwan's account of Hormuz reflects his experience of one of the key places where East met West. Hormuz, by his reckoning, was 25 days with a fair wind from India's Malabar coast. This would involve travelling about 61 nautical miles, 113 kilometres per day, across the Arabian Sea. Just as Western travellers did, Marwan defined Hormuz by its status as a global entrepot. Foreign ships from every place and foreign merchants travelling by land all come to this country to attend the market and to trade. Hence, the people of the country are all rich. Unlike Western travel writers, who complained about Hormuz's heat and commented on the residents' pendular testicles, he admired the city's wealth and the reverent, meticulous, and sincere religious and personal conduct of its inhabitants. Devout Muslims, refined and fair, stalwart and fine-looking, they wore handsome, distinctive, and elegant garments. Moreover, the city's civil and military officials and its physicians and diviners were decidedly superior to those of other places. He wrote approvingly that it had experts in every kind of art and craft. Marwan presents Hormuz as a superbly governed happy world city, pure and honest in its customs. Indeed, if a family fell into poverty, everyone gives them clothes and food and capital and relieves their distress. He was about as far as he would travel from China, and in the most international and diverse of ports, and it was here that he found an image of a harmonious and desirable urban society. At Hormuz, he greatly enjoyed watching the performance of a local trick involving a small white billy goat. In this performance, a man beat a drum, clapped his hands, and sang a song to which the billy goat capered about. The creature then climbed a wooden pole and stood on top of this pole and another, which was just about big enough for its 4 hooves, and made posturing movements like dancing gestures. The man added extra poles and height, and the little goat continued to move about. The finale was for the man to push the poles away and catch the goat in his hands. Marwan also recorded a set of tricks at Hormuz involving a large black monkey, which was blindfolded and struck on the head by a random member of the crowd. When the blindfold was removed from its eyes, the monkey was nonetheless able to go straight to whoever had struck him. "It is most strange," exclaimed Marwan. Another of the wonders of Hormuz was a local cat called the fly-over-the-grass, apparently a lynx or a caracal, with pointed black ears and a tortoiseshell coat. Marwan learned that this cat was mild, not vicious, and had the power to cause fierce animals like lions or leopards to prostrate themselves on the ground. The fly-over-the-grass was, according to Marwan, king among the beasts. Marwan's lynx has an intriguing counterpart in Christian accounts of the panther, a gentle animal with sweet breath and a pacific nature, which symbolized Christ in the medieval bestiary, the popular Book of Beasts. The accounts of the billy goat, the monks, and the lynx reveal Marwan's eye for the curious, outside his flotilla's ambitions for profit or conquest. His admiration for these animals chimes more generally with his praise of Hormuz, a place of cheap bounty, all the precious merchandise from every foreign country, of plentiful carrots and very large melons, pomegranates as large as teacups, and fragrant apples as big as a fist. Throughout his account of Hormuz, Marwan suggests the harmonious interplay between man and nature, in which the wealth of commerce stemmed from a delightful and propitious natural disposition. His curious eye stands in stark juxtaposition to the purposes of the journey of which he was part, to intimidate and dominate the trading world of Greater Asia, and to exact tribute from each place. As the Chinese boats left Hormuz, they were accompanied by a vessel on which the king of Hormuz had loaded lions, giraffes, horses, pearls, gems, and other gifts. He also sent an inscribed golden leaf, evidently showing the insignia and lineage of the Hormuz throne. There was a significant human cargo included too, of various chiefs and ambassadors. Many of them would stay in China for years. Some of those who sailed from Hormuz to Khan Balik in 1415 were only given leave to be conducted back home in 1421. Zheng He knew that the voyages he commanded were exceptional, for he left a legacy of several monumental stone steles. Two of these, at Nanjing and Nanshan, give thanks to Mazu, the celestial wife, the Chinese sea goddess and protectress of sailors. They represent a lasting monument not only to Zheng Hei's journeys, but also to the Ming dynasty's use of seafaring to display its wealth and power to the wider world. We previously met Henry of Derby as he prepared to embark on his crusade-cum-pilgrimage-cum-tour through Prussia, Europe, and the Holy Land in the early 1390s. Henry returned from Jerusalem via Famagusta, Rhodes, and Venice. He travelled with several souvenirs. These included a leopard, probably presented by the King of Cyprus, for which he had a room made on the galley to Venice. The leopard and his salaried keeper seem to have lived out their days shivering in the royal menagerie of the Tower of London. Henry's return luggage also included 4 cups made of ostrich eggs, several butts of wine, fine Venetian silks and linens, falcons with a Milanese glove, and a parrot in a cage hung from a cord. But his most precious souvenir was a Turk, picked up at Rhodes, converted to Christianity, and given the name Henry, like his master patron. A bed, a pilgrim's cape, a toga, a cloak, and several pairs of shoes were bought for Henry Turk on the way to England. At Troyes, the Turk was separated from Earl Henry's party and sent back to England, with the chaplain Hugh and 2 other priests and a falcon boating along the River Seine. Henry Turk is last heard of in the English town of Peterborough, with its imposing Gothic Benedictine abbey rising from the fenland. We have no record of his voice or feelings, or even his original name. Henry Turk was an unusual but not unique figure. For example, an Ethiopian named Bartholomew, who had possibly escaped from being enslaved in Sicily, went on the run in England in the 1250s. Later, in 1470, the wealthy Englishman John Paston wrote a letter boasting about a new little Turk, a Turkish dwarf, who it was reported had a penis as long as his leg. This Turk seems to have been an attendant in Paston's London house, possibly a Turkish soldier or ransomed captive who had made his way to England via Venice or Genoa. The fleeting presence of such figures in the historical record reminds us of those people for whom Western curiosity was not an abstract thought experiment. They were purchased, captured and converted, then brought to remote shores where they were left to prosper or to fail. Hetum of Armenia, circa 1245 to circa 1315, prince and prior, lived a life at the intersections of place and identity. He was born into the royal family of Cilicia or Little Armenia in what is now southeast Turkey, and his father was Lord of Koracus, Kiskelesi, on the coast due north of Cyprus and in the region of the fabled site of Sparrowhawk Castle. As a youth, Hetum was made governor of Koracus and married a cousin, Zabel, of the ruling Cypriot Ibelin family. His uncle was King Hetum I of Armenia, who had successfully negotiated his kingdom's place within the shifting political world of the 13th century Middle East. King Hetum was a skilled diplomat who gained an alliance with the Mongols to guarantee his country's safety. But from the 1260s, the Mamluks successfully overwhelmed the Armenian-Mongol pact, and over the following 100 years, the kingdom was ravaged and eventually dissolved. Hetum of Armenia appears to have taken part in embassies between England and France. Around 1299, he may have had made a pilgrimage to Paris, and by 1305 he had certainly left Armenia to join the monastic pre-monasterian order in their beautiful cliffside abbey at Belapai in Cyprus. This was a way of absenting himself from vicious dynastic struggles going on in Armenia, which led to 2 kings, Hetum II and Leon III, being assassinated in December 1307. At this point, Hetum had settled in the French city of Poitiers, where he became prior at the abbey and remained for about 18 months. He befriended Pope Clement V, 1264 to 1314, who was frequently at Poitiers and sought Western alliances for the Armenian crown and for his kingdom. Amalric Lusignan of Tyre died 1310, a claimant to Cyprus. At the same time, and apparently at the request of the Pope, Hetum composed a geography of Asia, one of the first of the Middle Ages. He dictated the text in French to a scribe, Nicolas Fausson, who then translated it into Latin. It was called The Flower of Histories of the Orient, and became an influential account of the world, as seen by an Armenian in exile. The Flower of Histories was soon a foundational text in communicating to Western Europe knowledge about Armenia and about the Mongol world. Much of Hetum's narrative concerns the rise of the Mongols stories of Genghis Khan and the conflicts between the Mongol rulers of the Greater Persian region and the sultans of Egypt. Hetum said little about his own travels, although he was clearly an eyewitness to many of the events he described and moved extensively between Armenia, Cyprus and France, and possibly much further afield. Members of the Armenian court were certainly at Rome in the west and Khan Balik in the east during this period. He summarized the three ways in which he gathered material for his book. First, from the histories of the Tatars. Secondly, from the eyewitness oral testimony of his uncle King Hetum, which was then committed to writing. And thirdly, from his own eyewitness recollections. I speak as he who was present in person, and what I have seen I have recorded truly. This neatly summarizes the medieval approach to writing about both travel and geography, as a mélange of past memories melded with the individual's voice and perspective. Hetum's book opens with a description of the realms of the East from Cathay to Turkestan to India to Persia, through Armenia and Georgia to Syria. As in Western geographies, Jerusalem and its environs are the place at which the world culminates. But for Hetum, the realm of Cathay, the most noble and rich realm of the world, was the necessary starting point. This was not only because of the contours of Mongol power, but also because the Cathayans were, according to Hetum, distinguished by their subtle labour and ingenious arts, their inventiveness in art and manual work. In his globe, the centre of gravity had shifted conclusively to the Far East, and ultimately his book sought to encourage European rulers to ally with the Mongols if they were ever to retake Jerusalem and the Holy Land. It is not surprising that Hetum's tract ends with an exhortation to his Western European readers to undertake a general passage, an international crusading expedition of pilgrims to recover the Holy Land. He therefore sought to spread knowledge about the East in order that it be reconquered, urging a mass movement of people by three routes. First, through Barbary, which he did not recommend, given poor knowledge of the condition of this country. Secondly, via Constantinople, the route taken by crusaders of old, but perilous because of the Turks in that country. Hetum added that, if this route were to be taken, Mongols would have to be used to ensure the way, bringing food to the pilgrims and providing reasonably priced horses. The third route, the other way that everybody knows, and preferred by Hetum, was by sea. This route, he said, would need each port to be fully provisioned for the pilgrims, and he recommended especially that they all come to Cyprus to rest themselves and their horses after the labour of crossing the sea. Alternatively, he recommended that the pilgrims go via Armenia, and they could tarry or even winter in the city of Tarsus, the capital of Little Armenia, where they could find great plenty of waters and pasture for their horses, and from where they could easily occupy the city of Antioch. Hetum's desire was transparent, to put Cyprus and Armenia at the centre of the changing European world, both to conquer the city of Jerusalem with the help of God, and to make an alliance with the Mongols which would ensure the integrity of Cyprus and Armenia against both the Turks and the Mamluks. His hope was that the might of the enemies, the Mamluks, would be confounded rather by two than by one, an early statement of the need for alliances. Written in Poitiers in the first decade of the 14th century, Hetum's manifesto turned out to be both nostalgic and naive. Jerusalem was not retaken by Christians. His text, however, became widely read and much copied as the practicality of crusading was abandoned in favour of misty-eyed romance and fantasies of chivalry. While Hetum's son Oshin, died 1329, became Lord of Coracus and played an active role in Armenian politics as king regent, Little Armenia collapsed by 1375, caught up in endless power struggles and territorial wars between Cyprus, Turkey, the Tatars and the Mamluks. The last king of Little Armenia, Levon V, 1342-93, was one of the main peacemakers between the English and French at a conference in Amiens, hoping to unite them against the Turks who had devastated his kingdom and sent him into exile. Levon died in exile in Paris in 1393, calling in vain for another crusade as exhorted by Hetum. As we have seen, the Mongol court at Karakorum and then at Khan Balik was international, cosmopolitan, diverse in nature. It was centripetal, attracting people from all over the world to it as a centre of power and wealth. It was also centrifugal, sending out ambassadors, diplomats, messengers, and pilgrims into the world. One such Mongol emissary was Rabban Bar Sarma, a Mongol Christian born near Khan Balik, who recorded his extraordinary travels. In the 1260s, Bar Sama set out on pilgrimage to Jerusalem with one of his students, Marcos. They made their way through Central Asia, arriving at the Armenian Silk Road town of Ani, then a thriving city, but now a desolate landscape of ruined churches and broken bridges. They were warned that their onward route through Syria was too dangerous, and so went to Persia and visited the Mongol court of Abaka Khan at Hamadan. During this journey, Marcos was elected bishop and then patriarch, taking the name Yarbalaha III. He suggested to Abaka Khan's successor, Arugan Khan, that his wise and venerable teacher and companion Bar Sama might undertake a mission further west, to build a Franco-Mongol alliance against their common enemy, the Mamluk sultans of Cairo, who then held Jerusalem. In 1287, Bar Sama, by now considered to be of a great age, at least in his mid-60s, set off from Baghdad for Europe. Arghun Khan gave him 2,000 pieces of gold, a paitsa, the Mongol bull cum passport, and 30 animals for transport. The patriarch gave him permission to depart and a letter of introduction. Bar Sama's account of his travels is unique and contains some wonderful details. Here we will look briefly at his journey through Europe and his impressions of it. His journey took him to Constantinople, where he embarked for Italy. Sailing through the Mediterranean, he witnessed the eruption of Mount Etna on 18th of June, 1287, a mountain from which smoke ascended all the day long, which burned with fire during the night and filled the air with the stench of sulphur. Echoing many who had travelled over these waters, Bar Sama said that the Sea of Italy was a terrible sea, in which thousands of people had perished. He reached Naples, after 2 months of toil and weariness and exhaustion, reflecting the dismal conditions of medieval sailing, especially awful for Mongols unaccustomed to the rigours of sea travel. At Naples, he met the monarch Charles II, Charles II, King of Naples, died 1309, and was well received. On 24th of June 1287, Bar Sama described his pleasure in sitting on the rooftop of his mansion overlooking the Gulf of Naples. The pleasure lay not in the serene view of the azure seas, but in admiring the way King Charles's forces attacked those of his enemy, James II of Aragon and Valencia, 1267 to 1327. He wondered at how precise and targeted the battle was, how the enemies managed to kill only combatants and not other people. He then proceeded to Rome and thence to Genoa, where he spent the winter. He admired the body of St. John the Baptist in a silver casket at the church of Sennalonia, the cathedral of San Lorenzo, and was shown an emerald paten, which was said to be the very plate from which Christ had eaten the Passover meal with his disciples. He went north through Onbar, Lombardy, to Paris, the capital of Frangistan, France, where he met King Philip IV the Fair, 1268 to 1314. His impression of Paris is touristic. He spent a month there, and he and his party saw everything there was in it. He was particularly struck by the number of students, 30,000, engaged in studying all kinds of books, of biblical commentary and exegesis, of philosophy, rhetoric, medicine, geometry, arithmetic, astronomy. These students were engaged constantly in writing, and all of them received grants for their subsistence from the king. He visited the royal mausoleum at Saint-Denis, where gold and silver statues of dead kings decorated their tombs, and 500 monks chanted for their departed souls. In sum, Bar Sama felt that he and his companions saw everything which was splendid and renowned. He proceeded southwest to Cassonia, Gascony, an English possession where he met the English king, Edward I, probably at Bordeaux, from where the English ruled. He returned to Genoa, where he saw a garden which resembled paradise. It was temperate all year, full of fruiting trees with green leaves in any season. And there was a vine which yielded a harvest of grapes 7 times a year, although the locals didn't make wine from it. Bar Sama's tour of Europe culminated in a stay in Rome, where he had a momentous encounter with the newly elected Pope Nicholas IV, died 1292. Bar Sama reported that he had addressed the Pope directly with the words, "Now that I have seen your face, my eyes are illumined, and I shall not go away broken-hearted to the countries of the East." The Pope awarded him a mansion in which to stay, with servants on hand to keep him well supplied. Bar Sama watched the Easter processions in Rome, including Palm Sunday, when countless thousands and tens of thousands of people gathered with olive branches. he saw the Pope conduct the service in luxurious vestments, a red costume with gold thread running through it, studded down to his sandals with precious gems, jacinth and pearl. Barsama's diplomatic mission was essentially unsuccessful inasmuch as he failed to gather an army against the Mamluks. But the Pope did give him relics of Christ's clothing, Mary's kerchief, and some small fragments of unidentified, possibly unidentifiable, saints too. The Pope also gave him 1,500 gold coins for his journey home. From Rome, Barsama travelled back over the sea, the way he had come, to Baghdad, where he wrote about his travels. While his account of the West is unique, it is also notably similar to Western accounts of the East, a narrative sustained by the perils of seafaring, of warfare, of paradisiacal gardens and unusual relics, of potent rulers and their infinite riches, of observed customs that lay between the strange and the recognizable. For Barsama, as for medieval Western travel writers, understanding the world meant discovering that it was not everything it had seemed to be. At the same time, Barsama's travels revealed the interplay between pilgrimage, diplomacy, missioning, and touristic curiosity, and the way the traveller's gaze could be directed from east to west. How to find the Fountain of Youth. The Fountain of Youth, inspired by biblical descriptions of the rivers of paradise and a well of living waters flowing from Lebanon, Canticles chapter 4, verses 12 to 16, was searched for by many medieval travellers. Most famously, the Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de León, in 1512, received a commission from the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, 1500 to 58, to capture the island of Bimini near Hispaniola, Greater Antilles, where health-giving waters were said to flow. Here are a few of the many medieval descriptions of the fountain. In the 13th century epic Juan of Bordeaux, the hero Juan finds a fountain of youth by the Nile in the Emir of Babylon's gardens. In the midst of this garden there was a fair fountain coming out of the river Nile that flows from paradise. This fountain was of such virtue that if any sick man drank thereof, or washed his hands and face, the unchaste should be made chaste, and also if a man had been of great age, he should return again to the age of 30 years, and a woman would become as fresh and lusty as a maid of 15 years. This fountain had that virtue for 40 years, but 10 years after Juan went there, it was destroyed and broken by the Egyptians, who had made war on the admiral then in Babylon. And when Juan had washed his hands and face in the fountain and drunk its water, he beheld the palace and thought it marvellously fair. And when he had long regarded it, he saw just beside the fountain a great serpent who guarded the fountain, to the end that none should be so hardy to drink or touch the fountain, for if any traitor or heretic touched it, he could not escape without death. But when the serpent saw Juan, he inclined himself without appearing to do him any ill. Sir John Mandeville identified the Well of Youth near Colombo on the island of Serendip, Sri Lanka. South of the city of Colombo is a hill that people call Colombo, from which the city takes its name, and at the foot of this hill there's a pretty well which has a sweet flavour of all kinds of spices, and it changes its flavour variously at each hour of the day. And whoever drinks 3 times a day from that well shall be healed from any kind of illness that they have. For I have drunk from that well, and I think I do feel better for it. Some people call it the Well of Youth, because those who drink from it seem eternally young and live without severe illness, and it is said that the well comes from paradise, for it is full of virtues. The poet and historian Jean Froissart, died circa 1405, in The Pretty Bush of Youth, showed that not everyone believed in the Fountain of Youth. I have heard talk of the Fountain of Youth and of invisible stones too. But these are impossible things, for never, by the faith of Saint Marcel, have I ever seen anyone who has said, I have actually been there. 14. A rough guide to the Antipodes and the end of the world. The Antipodes, Sumatra, Java, Pantan, the Sea of Death, Land's End. Medieval travellers, astronomers and merchants were very well prepared for the idea of new landmasses, new continents, and new civilizations appearing all over the globe. New in the sense that they were unknown, but old in the sense that they preceded European knowledge. Travel is often said to open the mind, to allow one to have fresh experiences. Yet in medieval Europe, the discovery of new places did not necessarily query fixed categories of knowledge, for travel writing had already primed every traveller to expect a world full of prodigies and marvels. In the 14th century, people told a story about a young man from Europe. It appeared in travel guides, chronicles, sermons, geographies, and poems. In the story, the young man set off from his home because he wanted to see the world. He was the clever and curious son of farmers who had never travelled far from their small herd of cattle. He went all the way to India and then carried on. Using boats, donkeys, horses, and his own 2 feet, he travelled 5,000 miles beyond India in the east into the lower part of the world. He was so far from home and saw so many marvels, he barely knew where he was. The greatest marvel, however, was the land he encountered where he found people speaking his own language and living as people did in his own village. They were even herding cows using exactly the same words that his own father and mother did. It seemed to him that he could travel no further, so he turned around, intending to travel all the way back home. But after a short while, he stumbled across his own house, his mother, his father, their cows, their pastures, all there at the very end of the world. He had travelled as far from home as he could, yet had somehow ended up at home. At first, the young man thought he had reached the Antipodes, the exact opposite side of the world, the southern region where people were thought to have their feet opposite to the people in the north. Crucial to the theory of the Antipodes, foot to foot, contrary to contrary, pole to pole, was the potential for the two sides of the world to correspond, as direct opposites, as radically alike rather than unlike. The travelling young man was not uneducated. He had studied a few books about the planets and the firmament, and he knew that the entire world was precisely 20,425 miles in circumference, although others said it was 31,500 Roman miles. It dawned on the young man that he had, in fact, travelled so far that he had gone entirely around the world, across the breadth of the whole thing, or perhaps around its entire height, up and down. Either way, he had circumnavigated the globe. His journey had taken him around the world by land and sea and returned him to his own country. The young man's parents, educated mostly in tending cows, thought the world had no underside, no bottom. If they thought about it at all, they thought of the world as a kind of line leading up to Jerusalem. And if one went downwards, one might lose one's balance and fall off into the unknowable expanses of the sky and the stars. If they had seen the map of the world, they assumed that the back of it, the globe's reverse, was full of sea, because they believed the only habitable part of the world was in the northern zone, their zone. And some of the preachers at church believed this too, and they had read in their books that it was foolish to believe in men living on the other side of the world. If one believed that the world had a top, the Arctic, a centre, Jerusalem, and a bottom, the Antarctic, the Arctic, and if one believed that the Antipodes were directly opposite to Europe, then one had to believe that crops and trees could grow downwards, or rain and snow could fall upwards. People like the young man's parents couldn't accept this. But the young man knew differently, and his vast voyage had proved it to him. One could travel all around the world without toppling off into the firmament. So now he knew that there were people on the opposite side of the earth. Just as he thought of them underneath him, they thought of him as being underneath them. And he thought he remembered how God said in the Bible, "Do not be afraid of me, who hung the earth from nothing." Job chapter 26, verse 7. The young man considered the round orb of the planet, its people and its seas and its cities, and its mountains all suspended in the air, held up by God's ingenious influence and incomprehensible control. The story of the young man who traversed the world all around and up and down made explicit the controversial proposition that the hot area around the equator, the torrid zone, buffeted by scorching seas, was evidently passable. Conventional geographical wisdom had long argued that this torrid zone was a barrier to human travellers. Later medieval scientific certainty about the Earth's roundness confirmed that both the biblical world and the known world of three continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe, could not fill its entire surface. There had to be more, whether inhabited or not. Look out for vegetable lambs growing on trees on the island of Kaldahar. You might see a kind of gourd or pumpkin that can be cut open when ripe. Within, one will find a little creature made of skin, bone, and blood, like a little lamb without wool. Kaldahar is a distant island beyond Tatari and Cathay, somewhere on the way to India and the Caspian Sea. These vegetable lambs are actually just like the barnacle geese that are said to grow on logs in Ireland. These barnacle geese initially have soft shells, then they grow mature, attached at the beak to the log. Once they are covered in feathers, they fly away, or so people say. By the later Middle Ages, men and women were frequently sailing across the earth from one side to the other. Indeed, the Malay Annals, compiled in the 15th century to tell the story of the emergence of the Malay monarchy since the 11th century, began with the story of Raja Iskandar, a Muslim version of Alexander the Great, a Roman of the country of Macedonia, who set out to visit the East and achieved lordship over the whole earth from east to west, from north to south. Ultimately, Iskandar was acclaimed as the originator of the dynasty crowned at Palembang, Indonesia, who founded Singapore and established the Sultanate of Malacca. Medieval Java, Sumatra, and the Malayan Peninsula dictated marine passage over an enormous area, and were always closely connected to global commerce, even as these regions were only haltingly apprehended by Europeans. The islands of Lamuri, the name given both for the kingdom of Banda Aceh and for all of Sumatra, and Java were the closest places to the Antipodes that Europeans visited in the Middle Ages. These islands were central to the spice trade and were deeply connected to the Indian Ocean world of commerce and travel. The term Java often covered a galaxy of islands in the Java Sea. Ibn Battuta, in the early 14th century, established that Java Minor can be associated with Sumatra, whereas Java Major, or Jawah, referred to what is now Java, Indonesia, and or Borneo and beyond. Descriptions of the territory called Java Major may also have embraced the northern coast of Australia. Both Marco Polo and the Franciscan missionary Odorico Pordenone describe Java Major as the largest island in the world, at over 3,000 miles in circumference, a description which cannot help but presage the way in which Australia would be evoked. In any case, locating the precise correspondence between medieval ideas and modern geography is less important than understanding that, long before the recorded first European arrival in Australia, the Dutch trader Willem Janszoon landed there in 1606, the Antipodes were a point of speculation and inquiry, promising a world both of wonders and of tantalizing similarities. Accounts of the lands of the Antipodes are few, but medieval maps often feature them, if obliquely. As with Beheim's globe, maps existed in a dynamic interplay with actual discoveries, as sirens, mythical islands, and biblical locales jostled for space with newly visited coasts and recently explored interiors. There was a heterogeneous tradition of mapping, including diagrams, charts, and sumptuous mappae mundi. On many maps, the Antipodes appear as a mirror or counterpart toward the bottom or south of the map, to the known world at the top or north. On Beheim's globe, Java and other islands in the region like Pentan and Candine are accompanied by short text about the Antipodes. These are, the globe says, situated so far south that the pole star is invisible, and instead the Antarctic star becomes visible. The globe continues to describe how this country lies foot against foot with respect to our land, and when it is day with us, they have night, and when the sun sets with us, they have their day. Moreover, half of the stars which are beneath us and not visible to us are visible to them. And Beheim adds his source, all this is because God has created the world together with the water of a round shape, as described by John Mandeville. East of Java, Beheim's globe shows a huge expanse of water studded with multicoloured islands, overlaid with text about the rest of the world. The watery, round world was thus made complete on the globe, a fourth part of the world before America became known as such, joining Java to Africa via the expanse of the seas. Other medieval maps vary greatly on how they presented what was beyond India and Java. Some placed the Antipodes at the rim of what they represented, usually in the southwestern or southeastern section of the map. In some cases, this suggested that a fourth continent should be inferred as being on the back or underneath, the Ecumene represented on the front of the map. Other maps simply place blank space in the Antipodes to represent their status as unknown and to suggest their emptiness. The medieval Antipodes thus came into being as a place barely visited, but known to exist. The Mirror of the World, a 15th century retelling of a 12th century encyclopedia, includes a vivid image of two men walking around the world in opposite directions and meeting, foot to foot and face to face, below their point of departure. The accompanying text explains that, like a fly goes round about a round apple, a man or beast can go round the entire extent of the earth all around it, so he should arrive under us, and it would seem to him that we were under him. and if he kept going, he would go so far that he should return again to the place from whence he first departed. By this point, it was clear that, theoretically speaking, circumnavigation of the world was possible in all directions, up and down, east and west, even if hazards and human fallibility always got in the way. In 1325, before he reached China, Odoric of Pordenone sailed in a junk from India to Sumatra. He visited various ports on the northern coast of the island and travelled around the Malay archipelago. He also visited Java, Borneo, and probably Brunei, and Southeast Asia via the Nicobar Islands. Odoric understood that he was approaching the Antipodes as he sailed to Lamuri, the northwest tip of the island of Sumatra, then part of the Pasai Sultanate, a great trading dynasty. It was a wonder for him to begin to lose sight of the North Star, Polaris, the pole star, as the Earth intercepted it. Odoric had not only broadened his horizons through travel, but had passed the horizon. The map of the skies waxed unfamiliar as the lodestar used for navigation by shipmen all over the northern hemisphere fell away, fixed in a different, distant sphere. For Odoric, Lamuri itself was distinctive on two main counts. First, the people, both men and women, went about completely naked. Not unreasonably, and following a logic Odoric must have understood, if not accepted. They told him that God had made Adam naked, so why go against divine will and wear clothes, especially in such fearsome heat? Secondly, the people there ate human flesh just like, said Odoric, Italians eat beef. They even bought children from overseas and sold them for flesh to butchers in the meat market. They had plentiful wheat, rice, camphor, aloes and plantains, but still loved the taste of human flesh. Europe's fascination with cannibalism is surely as old as European travel. Travellers' fancies confront the traveller with behaviours of which they have no personal experience, but are led to believe are widespread. It became a self-referential observation that, beyond Europe, cannibalism was rampant and therefore non-Christian people were not fully civilized. Charges of cannibalism tend to occur in ill-defined contact zones at the further outpost of the known and understood world. Akin to customs like sodomy and polygamy, cannibalism was held to be deeply shameful and yet remarkably common overseas, and travel writing offered a space in which it could be explored and prurently enjoyed. Medieval cannibalism was an intriguingly wide category, and the reasons for cannibalism were various. People were eaten by virtue of religion, cruelty, starvation, and justice. Odoric may well have heard about cannibals in Sumatra, but even if he hadn't, he would have expected to find cannibalism at the edges of the East, and his journey to novel frontiers would have been more convincing to his audience for the presence of cannibals there. Likewise, Sinbad the sailor of Baghdad, the figure of the consummate Islamic traveller, was said to have encountered cannibals on his third and fourth voyages to the east. At the Mountain of the Apes, possibly a version of Sumatra on account of its orangutan-like fauna, Sinbad's crew was devoured by a terrifying giant who roasted the men on coals. On his next voyage, the restless Sinbad was shipwrecked on an eastern island where the ghoulish Magian people robbed visitors with a special oil, which caused them to become foolish and to grow enormously fat. They would then be slaughtered, roasted, and fed to the king. Stories of Sinbad set in the 9th century but circulating throughout the Middle Ages similarly point to cannibalism as a key peril which marked out civilized travellers from the savagery of the island kingdoms they visited. After Sumatra, Odoric described Java as being a large island whose king had 7 kings in his dominion. It was, he says, well populated and had an abundance of spices and foods, though not of wine. Yet after he had called attention to these desirable products, Odoric gave an account of Java that sounded familiar, unexotic, predictable even. The king lived in a marvellous great palace, the most beautiful there is, with gold-plated walls decorated with stories of knights in battle. It could almost have been a royal court in France or Italy. Beyond Java, according to Odoric, was the island of Panten, seemingly some version of the island of Bintan between Sumatra and Singapore, or maybe the Hindu-Buddhist kingdom of Banten on the western side of Java. The trees there produced a beautiful flour for the making of fine white bread. Odoric said that he had eaten this bread, for all these things I have seen with my own eyes. Possibly recalling the sago tree, he stressed the capacity of God, even here, to offer nature in the service of mankind, in a mundane marvel that suggested Holy Communion appearing as natural sustenance. But Panten was also alive with natural danger. Odoric reported a terrible tree that produced the most deadly poison in the world. The only known antidote was human shit diluted with water. This was a much-repeated myth of a Javanese poison tree. It shouldn't have been so remarkable to Odoric because animal droppings were common in Western medical remedies. Cow and ox turds and goose and dove droppings were frequently used in European medicinal plasters and drinks. Local people could thrive in Pantin only thanks to the enormous canes growing by the seashore, which fruited with precious gems. These gems, when carried on the person, meant one could not be injured by iron or steel blades, and one's blood could not be let or shed. People even carved wounds into their arms in which to place these gems, as nature's talisman in a dangerous place. Beyond Pantin, the oceans raced southwards. Odoric described a dead sea, a sea of death, a body of water without a bottom. He warned that if one should have the misfortune to fall into this sea, one would never be found again. And if sailors let their boats stray too far from the shore, the waters of this awful sea would carry them down, never to return. Odoric was perhaps repeating what locals had told him about the Java Sea, or the Sunda Strait, or the Indian Ocean between Java and Australia. This was the southernmost point of Odoric's epic travels, the furthest into the Antipodes he was able, or dared, to go. He had travelled to the edge of knowledge and to the threshold of death. European maps likewise suggested the perils of straying too far towards the edge of the world. The Hereford Mappae Mundi, circa 1300, has the letters M-O-R-S, death, encircling the world. 4 points on every man's compass, a reminder of the earthly traveller's mortality. Frau Maurer's Venetian map of circa 1450 bears a legend southeast of India that ships sailing southwards would be carried by currents into the darkness, where, through the density of the air and the tenacious waters, they must perish. Similarly, Mandeville and others reported adamantine rocks in the eastern oceans, which drew iron towards them in a violent manner. Local ships were therefore made without nails or other ironware. Some people even said they had a kind of Long Island and had been told by sailors that it was the remnants of all the ships wrecked by the adamantine. The great vessels had been reduced to a fatal mass of trees and branches sprouting from the wreckage. If travel is a way to feel alive, that might be because in travel we flirt with danger before the waves of the oceans of oblivion reach out for us. The torpid seas beyond Pantin marked the limits of Odoric's knowledge, for he admitted that no one knew where people carried away by the waters were taken, or what became of them. Beyond Pantin, death encircled the world no matter how far one went. Everything in the Ecumene, its gold, its spices, its gorgeous palaces and solemn temples, would be swept away. The Antipodean seas became a river Styx, flowing with death, or maybe a Lethe, the waters of oblivion. A vortex, a watery maze, a sea of troubles, the devil's own ocean. Odoric's Sea of Death is entirely in keeping with the medieval Christian understanding of God's creation as too awesome for an individual to apprehend. The Sea of Death marked the point at which the only option was to turn back. It was on the shores of Pantin that Odoric accepted the limitations of his travelling inquiry, bowing to landscapes and forces greater than he. He took a boat north, from Pantin to Champa, now Vietnam, thence to Khan Balik, to places more accessible than Pantin's perilous shores. In fact, many medieval travellers turned their thoughts to the ends of the world rather than to homecoming. Marco Polo, like Odoric, described fatal seas at the edges of the known world. Between Java and the Andaman Islands, a sea so deep and turbulent that ships could neither anchor there nor sail away, so they were swept forever into its gulf. And south of Madagascar, a sea with a continual southwards current, from which any sailor was unlikely to return. Travel may broaden the mind, not through limitless discovery, but by helping us understand our limits and the world's limits. Thus, places called Land's End appear all over the globe, representing the limits of the traversable world. Other places like the Pillars of Hercules at Gibraltar were held to be the limits of the navigable ocean. Medieval world's ends included the Gallican Finisterre, Finis Terrae, Land's End, Finisterre in Brittany, Land's End, known as England Descender, England's End at the southwestern edge of England, Pembroke, Penbro, Land's End in Wales, and Ultima Thule, Thule the furthermost, variously identified with Shetland, Iceland, Greenland, or somewhere beyond. Johor, at the tip of the Malaysian peninsula, was known in the Middle Ages as Ujong Medini, Land's End. The main island of Singapore was called Pulau Ujong, the Isle at the End, and the port of Makassar on Sulawesi was known as Ujong Pandang, Horizon's End. For Maori, Cape Rainier, Underworld Cape, at the northern tip of New Zealand, became the most spiritually significant location, where spirits were said to leave this world to descend to the underworld. These were the ends of the world as we try to know them in a place. Thule was a kind of northern counterpart to the Antipodes. The historian and ethnographer Adam of Bremen, writing about 1070, was the first known European to write about North America in his account of the Norse settlement at Vinland, settled by Leif Erikson around the year 1000. Adam also wrote about Thule, which he said was situated at an immense distance from all other islands and remained barely known. It was called Ultima Thule because it was the last of all the islands in the ocean. At the summer solstice, it was never dark there, and at midwinter, there was no daylight. Thule was, said Adam, a distance of 6 days' sailing from Britain. He tentatively identified Thule with the volcanic island of Iceland. Thule's ice made the sea solid. This black, dry, and ancient ice would blaze away if set on fire. The people of Thule lived in a holy simplicity in underground pits, with just livestock to farm and clothing made of animal pelts. Instead of towns, they have mountains and springs as their delight. Adam hymned. They would share whatever they have with both foreigners and locals, one of many meritorious customs in their culture. Beyond Thule, there was nothing else. Gabriel Tetzel, a German patrician travelling from Nuremberg in the 1460s, rode out to Finisterre in Galicia after visiting Santiago de Compostela. He noted that the peasants called the place Finsterstern, Dark Star in German, even though its correct name was Finisterrae, Land's End. But both seemed fitting. One sees nothing anywhere but sky and water, said Tetzel. He was told that the seas that became so turbulent that none could cross them. Galleys and ships had set off to discover what was beyond these seas, but none had ever returned. Further to the southwest, too, there was another limit to the traversable world, Cabo Now, or Cape No, a terminal point and a promontory in West Africa. According to Alvise Cadamosto's account of the navigator and slaver Nuno Tristão's journey to Mauritania in 1443, the Cape had gained this name because anyone who rounded it never returned. This was the limit that Prince Henrique the Navigator, 1394 to 1460, Infante of Portugal, longed to cross, and he sent fleets of his best caravels to sail everywhere successfully, to learn new things, and to cause injury to the Moors living in the region. He was fascinated by Prester John, but was intrigued too by the possibility of deepening Portuguese trade into and beyond the Sahara. His first fleet that passed Cape No by 100 miles found only sandy and arid land, neither dwellings nor people, so it turned back. A second fleet passed the Cape by 150 miles, but also found nothing. He kept on sending out his caravels full of victuals, arms and munitions, until they found something. Eventually the Portuguese boat met with brownish men from Berber tribes, and then at last they discovered the country of the first blacks, and after that other races of these blacks of varied tongues, customs and beliefs. Curiosity and voracity for land and profit had got the better of these travellers. The development of lateen-sailed caravels that could manage the open seas, the systematic charting of the Atlantic and African coasts, and the use of more accurate astronomical methods of navigation all contributed to a sense of a world that could be conquered, not by individual travellers, but by the nations they represented. By passing Cape No, to the strangely aligned desires both to know more and to wage war, these Portuguese caravels can be seen as representative of a new era of travel, positively called the Age of Discovery, but perhaps better called an Age of Conquest and Expropriation, in which travellers refused to accept long-held limits on where they could or should travel. 15. Coda. Journey's End. Most travellers feel at some point that they have had enough, that they long for the familiar, that the time for travel has ended. Yet while many medieval travellers write about the moments of departure and arrival, not all write about the voyage home. For many travellers, one of the first things they did on arriving home was to set about composing an account of the journey they had undertaken. Those who do describe their return give us a glimpse of the indefinite feelings of homecoming, and the moment of a journey coming to its close. Ibn Battuta, for instance, raced home across Asia and North Africa in 1348 and 1349, as plague tore through the world's cities. At Damascus, he saw thousands of people dying of the pestilence, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim victims weeping together in the streets as they clutched their holy books, imploring God to end their suffering. Ibn Battuta reached his home in the glorious land of Morocco in November 1349, where he temporarily laid down the staff of travel. He found, after his travels around the world, that Morocco was the best of lands, with plentiful fruit, fresh water, and nourishment. The Sultan of Morocco embodied and surpassed all the virtues of the rulers Ibn Battuta had encountered from Java to Constantinople. In his hometown of Tangier, Ibn Battuta visited his mother's tomb, and then he himself grew sick. He was confined with an illness for 3 months, and then he was on the road again, travelling to Al-Andalus via Gibraltar to take part in the wars against the Christians. Our old friend John Mandeville wrote that he came home via Rome to get his book of travels confirmed and ratified as true by the Pope and all the wise men in Rome. This certainly didn't happen. The Pope was in Avignon for a start, and much of the material in Mandeville's book is patently untrue. It's likely that the story of the homecoming via Rome was a monastic joke by the author of Mandeville's book, mocking the idea that physical travel confers some kind of experiential advantage on the traveller, laughing at the notion that wandering around the world might yield true or valuable knowledge. As any cloistered medieval monk knew, one often understood things one had not seen, and one saw things one could not understand. The truth of travel as an idea resided in its ability to stimulate reflection on the mysteries and wonders of God's world, and one didn't need to leave the cloister for that. However, one of Mandeville's readers, the seasoned pilgrim William Way, marked his homecoming in a radically different fashion. After his second visit to Jerusalem in 1462, Way returned to his monastery in the English village of Eddington, on the edge of the bleak reaches of Salisbury Plain. Here he constructed a remarkable Jerusalem chapel, a multimedia creation of buildings, books, maps, vestments, images, souvenirs, and relics. The building, built off the main choir of his church, included a painted cloth showing scenes of Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives, and Bethlehem, a paper crucifix which he had bought in Jerusalem, some stones from Jerusalem and Bethlehem brought back by Way, and a replica of the Holy Sepulchre itself made in boards or planks. Way's installation gives a strong sense of how place was portable. The pilgrim could bring Jerusalem with them, and almost infinitely translatable. Way's written testament funding the building of the chapel stipulated that nothing should ever be removed from it, but it appears to have been a victim of the English Reformation, swept away by Protestant reformers in the 16th century. They did not believe in the holiness of pilgrimage, the value of relics, or the pardons and indulgences dispensed to travellers. The ever-garrulous Felix Fabry included a poetic account of his return to Ulm in January 1484. As he rode through the Iller Valley south of Ulm, a torrential downpour soaked him, and this was the worst moment in his entire journey. He felt sad, spineless, shrunken with cold, impatient and anxious, all the turbid feelings of homecoming manifested in a rainstorm. But when he saw Ulm itself, he felt joy, comfort and pleasure at being back in its presence, joy equal to the misery he had felt at being away. He hardly recognized the city, for its splendid new walls had been completed in his 9-month absence. As Fabry was crossing the Herdbrücke over the Danube, local people started to recognize him, and some ran to the convent to seek a reward for delivering the good news of his return. Fabry got to his convent gate, but found that the brothers were at vespers, loudly chanting and singing their evening prayers. He struck the door hard in order to be heard, but in vain. It is always surprising for the traveller to discover that life goes on when they are away, that others' routines have remained intact. The city had changed, but the rhythms and habits of everyday life had kept their dependable shape. Eventually, the convent dog, usually an angry barking beast who guarded the gate, sensed Fabry's presence. In Fabry's account, the dog started to emit unusual howls and joyful snuffles, and scratched at the gate from inside with his paws and teeth as if trying to break it down. Fabry opened the gate. The impatient dog leaped into his arms, snuffling, his tail wagging, and then hared through the convent at full pelt, whining happily all the time, announcing the arrival of a friend. Mirroring the dog, Fabry's prior, Ludwig Fuchs, ran to Fabry and, forgetting his senior station and great age, leaped on him as if trying to extinguish a fire, clinging to his neck in a friendly embrace. The rest of the brothers gathered round and led Fabry in a procession to the main altar, all falling to the ground in honour of the sacrament and receiving a blessing. The brothers could then spend the rest of the evening chatting amiably about Fabry's experiences. It transpired that they had received false reports that he had died at sea or had been taken captive by Turks. Fabry's homecoming is a portrait of joyful reunion, completed by his closing depiction of finally, and reluctantly, shaving off his many-months-old beard. A beard, he said, is a natural ornament that beautifies a man's face, but on returning to his profession as a friar, he felt he should once again conform to the expectations of his order and look venerable, rather than strong and fearless. The beard had marked his temporary identity as a travelling pilgrim. Its removal marked his reintroduction into his daily, static life. Nonetheless, Fabry hints that he felt himself changed inside, and through travel had become a better friar and superior preacher. Meanwhile, the redoubtable Odoric of Pordenone did not describe his journey home, but closed his account of his travels in a terrible valley somewhere deep in Asia. In this valley, 7 or 8 miles long, and carved by a river of delights, was the hideously deafening sound of drumming and other music. And on the valley's floor were littered hundreds of corpses, the bodies of non-Christian men who had perished almost instantly upon entering that fearsome place. In the rock on one side was the very great and terrible face of a man. Here Odoric says his spirit died within him. He began to repeat to himself the words, verbum caro factum, the word became flesh, John chapter 1 verse 14. An incantation that reminded him that he travelled with the spirit and grace of God, and that all created things in this world were part of a divine plan. The supernatural was the counterpart to the miraculous, in a world at once thrumming with omnipresent holiness and extreme ungodliness. When he finally returned to Europe and the familiarity of his monastery at Padua, Odoric was asked by his superior, Giordotto, to dictate an account of his travels to a fellow friar, Guglielmo of Solagna. So it was that in May 1330, Odoric described where he had been and what he had witnessed. He said he included only that which he had seen with his own eyes, or which had been told to him by faithful men. Here the wonder of travel was turned into the storytelling of travel writing. Odoric avoided ornate language, speaking instead in a homely way, so his account could be understood by both the lettered and the unlearned. A few months later, Odoric set off for Avignon to visit the Pope. However, he was not to reach his destination. He was taken ill and was warned by a wise old man dressed as a pilgrim to turn back and to head for his native province of Friuli. The old man told Odoric to make haste, as he had only 10 days left to live. People would later say that this old pilgrim was the spirit of Saint Francis of Assisi himself. Odoric died 10 days later at Udine, the Friulian capital, in January 1331. He had been to the world's very edges, to the brink of knowledge, but it was at home near his place of birth that he met his death. In the months after Odoric's death, healing miracles were reported at his tomb. One visiting woman was said to have tried to cut off his finger to take away with her as a pious souvenir, in the hope that the blessings of travel might continue to accompany her. Odoric's story bears out the idea that at the end of our exploring, we arrive where we started, but we understand that starting point anew. On returning from their journey, the traveller is somehow changed, wise in new ways, having encountered radical difference and wonderful similarity, their home life and prior knowledge thrown into a new relief. Travel forces us to consider the significance of our lives and to encounter the littleness of the human amid the planet's variety and unknowability. As he struggled homewards, the dying Odoric may well have felt that the earth he had traversed had itself become tiny, nothing more than a series of points on a small surface, and that the time had come to turn from earthly things to the celestial. This was not to cease roaming, but to search instead for yet other worlds. As the sun set and the blue deepened into night, Odoric received his passport into the skies, to join those released from their bodies and from earthly travels into the brilliant circles amid the blazing stars, where the soul would begin its mysterious incorporeal journey towards the horizon of infinity.
This concludes A Travel Guide to the Middle Ages by Anthony Bale, narrated by Isha Ladi. Copyright 2023 by Anthony Bale. Production copyright 2023 by Penguin Audio. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with W. W. Norton and Company Incorporated and was produced in the year 2024 by Tantor Media Incorporated, a division of Recorded Books, which holds the copyright thereto. Please visit tantor.com for more information on our growing library of unabridged audiobooks.